thanking you all once again for joining us for day 2 of the 2022 Evidence Summit for Interreligious Action. Yesterday was a really full day, and I was hoping I could give a quick summary of some of the great conversations that we had yesterday. So yesterday, of course, we began the day with a keynote from Adam Phillips, who is the Executive Director of the Local Faith and Transformative Partnership Hub at USAID. And just letting you all know that he asked us all in sort of the interreligious community to comment on USAID's draft Building Bridges in Development, a policy on engaging faith-based and community partners. I'm going to drop a link to that policy where you can comment on the policy in the chat and also in the lobby chat. I just wanted to let folks know of that. In the other sessions, we then explored sort of key barriers and best practices for integration of faith actors in policy development and implementation. We also listened in on debates on the state of evidence on religion in peace and conflict, and learn about what we know about interreligious action and what can be done to improve our evidence. And then we heard from this a wonderful group of women and youth who are involved in multi-religious peace-building efforts. And then we sort of took a look at what effective women and youth-led collaboration in peace-building looks like. We then also finally reflected on how we can make monitoring, evaluation, and learning accessible to faith actors, and how we can advance and support new ways of producing research evidence on faith in humanitarian development and peace sector. Today, however, is a shorter day than yesterday, and I am so excited that we are starting the day with a keynote from Professor Azza Karam, and it's really my honor to introduce Professor Karam. Professor Karam serves as the Secretary General of Religions for Peace. She holds a Professorship of Religion and Development at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. Professor Karam currently is a member of the United Nations Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. Prior to joining Religions for Peace, she served for nearly 2 decades in the United Nations, UNDP and UNFPA, including as the coordinator of the Arab Human Development Reports, senior advisor on culture, and lead facilitator trainer for UN Strategic Learning Exchange on Religion, Development, and Diplomacy. And before I hand it over to Professor Karam, I also wanted to mention that one of our inspirations for putting together this summit was Professor Karam's article on the last Evidence Summit, which is called the USAID Strategic Religious Engagement Summit, What Was Not Said. I thought that was an excellent title. And also her call to action in that article on what we can do to support interreligious and multi-religious efforts. Just wanted to make a note and provide credit where credit's due. Lots of the themes and questions that we have posed in the summit and that we have explored have been inspired by her article and her work. And the work of other participants and authors of the last summit. If you haven't already, I think Professor Karam's article and the journal issue reflecting on the past summit is definitely worth checking out. I will share the link with you in the chat. But for now, I want to hand it over to Professor Karam. And first, thank you for taking time to be with us, even though I know you have a pretty full schedule. So thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you, Professor Karam. You are muted, Professor Karam. Can you hear Dr. Karam?
I am not muted per my own thing. Okay.
Right now. Sorry about that.
No, I'm so glad it happened now. We definitely have proof, talking about evidence, that we are having a virtual online session, because if that doesn't happen, this muted business doesn't happen, it kind of is doubtful. I wanted to say thank you so much, Mr. Upadhyay, and thank you also to Jessica Baumgart for this opportunity to be with you here today, and for inviting me, and for your very, very kind words. As you all know, I stand on the shoulders of many, many giants in this space of religious engagement on issues of international assistance, development, as well as obviously human rights and peace building. I absolutely owe a great deal in this space, which is a space of constant learning. And this is a point I just wanted to make very quickly, but very urgently, that the work of engaging with religion, and religions engaging with one another, and religions engaging in service to communities, which is the oldest work ever, that of religion serving communities, that this work is a work of constant learning. There is no such thing as an optimum ideal phase. We don't reach the optimum ideal in working religiously and interreligiously, but we are actually constantly learning as we serve in this space. And I wanted to say that of all of those I'm learning from, the faith leaders of who we are blessed to have in Religions for Peace, who come from so many different religious institutions and represent almost all the world's faith communities, that these faith leaders are endless fountains of learning, of wisdom, and of service to their communities. So I think it's important for us to distinguish that we speak about religious leaders or faith leaders. We also need to take into account that there are multiple ways in which religious organizations come together and are in existence. Some are religious NGOs. I'm here at a high-level dialogue convened by the United Nations High Commissioner for refugees, all about the imperative of protection of what is today the largest ever community of displaced and refugees. We have 100 million of those. Now, guess what? 4 out of the top 10 NGOs that are serving in this humanitarian space, 4 out of the top 10 global servants of humanitarian need are actually religious organizations. So religious organizations are a very critical part of the service areas, whether it is about serving normal needs such as education, nutrition, sanitation, health, public health, my goodness. But they are also first responders and some of the top first responders to communities in humanitarian disasters, which we are anticipating, unfortunately, more and more of as the climate impacts on us. So we're not anymore, I think, asking for the larger secular parameters of community, whether governmental or intergovernmental, to acknowledge the work of religious actors, but we are now actually having quite a lot of limelight on the religious world. There's a lot of interest in the work of religious organizations and religious communities. And while that interest is on the whole positive, I mean, finally, they can see what has always been there. It's great that the limelight is shed. But I think it also puts an added imperative on those engaged in the religious world to not only show the evidence of their work, but actually show the evidence of their value added, right? So yes, the oldest servants to humankind, absolutely. But what is today the value added of that religious service? And I don't just mean the value added of an organization like World Vision or Caritas or whatever doing their work. There's plenty value added there, but I don't mean that anymore, because that would have been perhaps interesting when we were trying to make the case in the beginning that religious organizations serve. But what I'm speaking about particularly is the multi-religious imperative. And the multi-religious imperative is the ability and the determination, the ability to actually work together as different religious actors, as different faith communities, to actually work together, to serve together. It is not good enough. It is necessary, but insufficient that religious organizations continue to provide and serve for their communities. Nobody's ever going to take that away, by the way, because governments are today unable to deliver to their peoples. Intergovernmental organizations, we're talking about a crisis of multilateralism. Intergovernmental organizations are equally unable to satisfy all the needs that are there of multiple populations. So therefore, the point here is nobody's going to take away the service. In fact, it is much more required, perhaps than ever before in human history. But what we are talking about today is the absolute imperative of religious organizations working together. Now, why? Why must religious organizations work together? So many of my Catholic and Muslim brothers and sisters ask me that question, but we're doing so much. Why do we need to? Why do we need to collaborate? Why should we cooperate? It's hellish to do so. True, it is extraordinarily challenging to collaborate, but the need to do so is for the obvious 3 reasons that I would like to share with you. Reason number 1, When religious organizations work together, the opportunity for fundamentalist thought or tendencies is actually significantly undermined, if not utterly diminished. It's very hard to be a religious fundamentalist while you're working and collaborating to serve with another organization or another religion. It's really very hard to be fundamentalist to do that, to actually serve. Now, it's actually possible to be fundamentalist and deeply conservative about certain aspects, especially related to women's rights, by working together. We've seen this. Those of us who work in the UN have seen this and continue to see this, where conservative groups from different religions indeed do have an ability, rather uncanny, extremely professional ability, to come together and work together. That is possible. But you see, it's possible as long as it's on the level of rhetoric. What we're speaking about here is it has to be at the level of service, actually delivering services to communities. So one good reason is it becomes really, really difficult to be overly conservative or fundamentalistic in the interpretation of your own sacred text or narratives or religious narratives or discourse when you're busy serving alongside, together with, and investing your resources and energy with other religious organizations. The second reason why there is a multi-religious imperative is because, quite frankly, and this we're seeing with governments and intergovernmental organizations, the needs far exceed the abilities and the supplies. So the demand for humanitarian services, for development services, the demand far exceeds the existing supply. So actually working together and pooling resources together, whether they are human or financial, or even just the resource of energy and goodwill and spiritual communion, these resources are more needed than ever before. We need to pool so we can economize, so we can become much more efficient in the way that we deliver to the increasing mass of need. And the third reason why it is imperative we do so is because at the end of the day, many political regimes, particularly authoritarian ones, are increasing their sense of appreciation for religious brotherhood and sisterhood. In other words, we are seeing a tendency where authoritarian regimes are befriending more and more and trying to adopt and co-opt many religious actors, many religious organizations. Now, of course, it's up to everybody what they wish to do, but there's a concern at a moment when we're talking about a shrinking civil space, a concern at a moment when we're talking about democracy and human rights being threatened species alongside with the biodiversity in our environment. Because of this, we must be concerned about authoritarian regimes that try to co-opt some of our religious brothers and sisters. And because this is happening, it is extremely difficult to co-opt a multitude of religious actors. It's impossible, just like it's impossible to be fundamentalistic when you're working together. It's also actually rather impossible to co-opt different religious actors, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Buddhist. It's impossible. You can only co-opt one. Right? So when there is a multi-religious engagement as the sine qua non, it makes it more difficult to be co-opted by authoritarian tendencies from the government side. Those are 3 out of a good 10 reasons, but I wanted to mention those 3 so that, in a sense, to provoke that we think about them more. Now, how do we collaborate? How do we cooperate as different religious organizations? Each religious organization invariably has its extremely well-developed, very long-standing, very wide-reaching developmental and humanitarian services. I mean, they've been doing it for decades, centuries, right? Long before the secular entities came into town. So each religious NGO and many religious institutions already have highly developed schools and clinics and other public services, and they've already got. So the challenge is immense in how do you actually then coordinate, because just running your own entity is several migraines and a half. So how then do you actually work together? And I think we are still learning. Remember, I said it's a constant process of learning. But one of the things we are learning, and the evidence points to, that if you try to do it as okay, here's your project, here's my project, now let's see if our personnel are going to be able to work together to deliver in the same way. That is a good ambition. but it is extraordinarily difficult to implement. And instead, what may be, in fact, we know from practice of over 50 years in Religions for Peace as an interreligious, as a multi-religious organization that's also been actively engaged in over 90 countries, delivering services in many ways, we've learned one really important thing. You can get the individual entities, institution A, institution B, institution C, to try to work together. Or you can work through an interreligious platform or structure that's already developed, acknowledged, accredited by the different religious institutions and faith communities, and that already has experience in delivering services to their communities. They already have their interfaith youth communities, they have their women of faith communities, usually the most active, by the way. Working with these existing interreligious structures is actually not only possible, but has produced productive results, because you don't have to get the personnel of your respective institution to figure out how to partner and collaborate with the other personnel of the other institution. You can certainly go on trying to do that, but in the meantime, you can already get an experienced body in serving together to be the agents of this multi-religious service. Interreligious structures, and this is my last point, I promise, interreligious structures are not fully functional, superbly efficient, impeccably managed entities. Actually, no institutional structure is governmental, intergovernmental, or non-governmental. All human-made structures bring the beauty of being humans together, but they also bring some of the challenges of being humans together. So the point here is not to expect and say, okay, let's go and search for, or let's go and build an interreligious structure that's going to help us coordinate. That is interesting, but it is unwise, because the last thing we need to do is replicate multi-religious structures or interreligious structures in the same country doing exactly the same thing. The challenge we have in front of us today is that because there's so much interest in the work of religion, because religious institutions now are called upon more than ever to serve and serve more and serve better and serve more efficiently, duplication, replication becomes almost, forgive me for saying this, almost sinful. We should not have the luxury to duplicate and replicate because each one of us wants our own particular institutional stamp or branding on the effort of service. We should, and we are called upon more than ever now, where there are existing interreligious structures, work with them. If they're dysfunctional, help them, build them, support them to become more functional. That too is part of delivering to communities. Because at the end of the day, the multi-religious service is also sending a message to all humanity, that people of faith, motivated by their faith, regardless of that faith, stand to be servants to not just humankind, all humankind, which is an imperative all our faiths call upon us to do. Right? No faith says go only serve those who believe like you do. So it's not just that it's an imperative morally from our respective faith traditions, almost all of them, but it's also because, quite frankly, like I said, the need is high and duplication is hurtful. It will only mean that there's less people actually receiving the services because you're so busy rebranding and redelivering and reinitiating and redesigning existing services instead of widening the scope and the outreach that you can actually reach people with. Those are my points. I hope I've provoked you enough, and thank you so much.
Professor Karam, thank you so much for that really motivating and inspiring speech, and really appreciate you giving us the time. I also want to thank everyone for attending today. We have we have 4 different sessions today, so I hope you join us for those as well. But yeah, it was great seeing you, Professor Karam, and thank you so much for joining us today.